Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Israeli elections debrief, or maybe it's a pre-brief on the next Israeli government. As people roll in, please let us know in the chat who you are, where you're calling in from, and maybe some favorite place or thing to do in Israel. You can put your favorite city. You can put your favorite Knesset member from current or history, anything you want to say to introduce yourself, but go ahead and use the chat at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop, on the side if you're on a what is that thing called? Mobile device, phone, tablet. We're just going to give people a chance to roll in because we've got a good, healthy registration here. So mention your, I'll start with one of my favorite places in Israel, if I can get the chat up, which I'm having trouble doing. Sorry. And when you use the chat, you want to chat to all participants, not just, which looks like it's disabled. So can we make sure, Matt and Aaron, that we have it, you can chat to all participants, which I'm not seeing that I can do. So I bet our audience can't either. So if we can fix that, that'd be great. And meanwhile, I'll just keep filibustering. So Jacob's in our office on the Lower East, in the financial district of Manhattan, and Yohanan, you're in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? Where are you?
Hod HaSharon.
Hod HaSharon. Okay.
Just a Tel Aviv suburb. The office is in Jerusalem. I'm in Hod HaSharon now.
Got it. Okay, now we can chat to everyone. So just as you guys are rolling in, welcome again. I'm Jodi Rudoren. I'm Editor-in-Chief of The Forward. We are very excited to have with us Yohanan Plesner of the Israel Democracy Institute and Jacob Kornbluh, our own chief political correspondent. If you'll take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us where you're calling in from and your favorite place in Israel or favorite thing, that would be great. And I'm putting mine in. I'm missing it right now, my favorite shakshuka place. Rhonda Jacobson, my old friend from Newton, Massachusetts, says wherever her family is. But Rhonda, just reminding everyone, Rhonda and Nancy, I see you're chatting to host and panelists. Go ahead and select everyone when you chat so that everyone can see your comments. And I will get us started now. Thank you again for joining us. Good Boker Tov to those in America, Erev Tov to those in Israel. I am really excited to have with us Yohanan Plesner and Jacob for this really important event. When we scheduled this event, we had some trouble scheduling this event. We were like, should we do it right after the Israeli election? Well, then everybody will be thinking about the American election. What about right after the American election? We ended up with this date, figuring it will take a while after the 5th election in 4 years, might take a while to sort out the votes. Turned out totally different than we expected, but now we have very auspicious timing because, of course, yesterday, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, Benjamin Netanyahu, was given the reins again to come back for a 3rd round in office. And the Knesset will be sworn in tomorrow, and he is hoping to get his coalition government together by the end of the week. Yohanan Plesner is my absolute favorite person to talk about Israeli elections with. He has been for the last decade the head of the Israel Democracy Institute, a really important independent think tank there that studies elections as well as other issues relating to democracy like the judicial system. Yohanan himself served in the Knesset for 6 years as a leader of the Kadima party. I just found out myself from looking at Wikipedia, he was actually born in London, moved to Jerusalem when he was 2 months old, has spent a lot of time in America, including going to Harvard. And we're just thrilled to have him. We've done events with him before. He really will teach us a lot about what happened 2 weeks ago and what is going to happen in this next government. And then we also have with us Jacob Kornbluh, as I said, our senior political correspondent who covers what's going on in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as well as in New York and Washington and everywhere in between. Spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania this cycle. And we will talk a little bit also about any parallels or non-parallels we see with our own midterm elections. Just a little bit of tachlis before we get started. You are welcome to use the chat throughout our conversation to comment on what you're hearing. We also would love your questions. There's a different button called Q&A at the bottom or side of your screen. I see Alon Berkman has already put a question in there asking, will the recording be made available? And the answer to that is yes. You will all receive in your email the recording of this event, as well as any some slides and some clips that we mentioned, some articles. And also anyone who, if you signed up for the event and you didn't make it, obviously you're not here listening to me, but those people will also get the video, and we will also promote it on our social media channels. So do not worry, you will have plenty of chance to share this video with your friends. But do put into the Q&A questions that you have. You can do that throughout the conversation, and we will certainly take them and use your questions to help shape our comments. But so chat for chatting, Q&A for questions, and we'll start by just asking Yohanan to kind of give us an overview, get us up to speed, and particularly tell us what you expect to see in the next couple of days in terms of Netanyahu's coalition. How will this government be different than all other governments?
Well, Jodi, thanks for having me, and it's a great honor and privilege. And I'm actually reading through the chat in some wonderful places in Israel. I keep thinking, what is my place? One place that comes to mind is Chof Neurim, the Neurim beach next to Bet Yanai, a beautiful place where I discovered it during COVID when I moved to swim from the swimming pools to the sea. So this is my bit filling in your quiz. Now, after 4 years, we've reached a decisive outcome. So it's like if you take the analogy of two, a wrestling match where when they wrestle for 4 years and they hug each other and there's a tie and endless rounds and additional rounds. So politicians are dead tired, and the Israeli people, and we've been through so much, 5 election campaigns, 4 years, because I counted in December of 2018, when the Knesset, Netanyahu's government, then the Knesset dispersed and Netanyahu went for an election, and since then we had interim governments and a unity government and a change government, but it was basically an unstable outcome. And now, if we want to see, look at the positive aspects, the political crisis is over. There's a decisive outcome. This government, the upcoming government, is expected to serve for, again, everything can happen, but it's now it's plausible to assume that it will serve for 3 or 4 years. It has a wide majority of 64 versus 56 in opposition, in a heterogeneous coalition versus 64 that are very cohesive and homogeneous. Interestingly, those 64 compared to 56, when you look at what you call in American language the popular vote, almost parity, 2.3 million for each of the blocks, a difference of less than 0.5% of 30,000. But this difference produced a huge difference in number of parliamentary seats, of 8 seats, mainly as a result of the fact that the historical Zionist left-wing party Meretz didn't cross the threshold. They were just beneath the 3.25%, 3,000 votes less. So it's around, give or take, 150,000 votes that went down the drain. And the Balad party, one of the 3 parties representing the Arab minority, also around 3%, give or take 140,000 votes. And therefore, the parity in popular vote turned into a decisive outcome in favor of Mr. Netanyahu.
All right, so I'm going to pause you for just a second, Yohanan, to just briefly explain for the novices. So because of the multi-party system, Yohanan is referencing this, there's sort of a strategy around when to have, smaller parties versus combining parties. And there's this threshold, you have to get 3.25% of the overall vote in order to make it into the Knesset. If you don't, the people who that you just don't exist, and the votes get reapportioned essentially through the parties that do make it. So there's a strategic fail, I guess, of the left-wing Zionist parties and the Arab parties to not have reorganized themselves to make it over the threshold or not have succeeded. But I want to just so it seems like two things, just to underscore what you said. Like, so we had 5 elections in 4 years, and we're going to end up with we're finally getting to stability, as you said, or a decisive victory, but it's a little bit like deja vu all over again. We're going back to a prime minister that was where we started with all this five elections, right? The same prime minister, and the underlying division, as you just showed, is still there. So I guess I'd ask both of you what you think has in fact changed. How is it that that after 5 elections we're ending up with the same prime minister that we had before, and what will be really different about this next round of Netanyahu's leadership that you expect? We'll start with you, Yohanan, and then Jacob, you can add.
Well, much has happened during those 4 years, and therefore the new Netanyahu government would probably look very different. The Likud is not the same Likud, the ultra-Orthodox parties are not the same, and his political partners are not the same. So it's going to be very, very different. The ultra-Orthodox parties have been out of power for the past year. It's traumatizing for parties that are that they represent populations that very much depend on government policy, government subsidy, and they populate the lower socioeconomic echelons in Israel, and therefore very much are dependent on government subsidies. It's true that government policy and allocations didn't change much during the period of the change government, but a few symbolic and changes that were made, for example, regulation of cell phones, higher taxes on sweet drinks, for health purposes, were perceived as an attack on the very nature of the ultra-Orthodox community and so on. But now there's a return, and in this respect, an expected change of trajectory. And what do I mean? The combination of the attempt to significantly weaken the court, plus much stronger self-confidence, and the fact that Netanyahu has no options but the ultra-Orthodox parties, and he also is loyal to them because they were loyal to him, throughout this 4-year period, created a very cohesive alliance, and where it translates into policy, and we see it now during the coalition negotiation. Requirement to double the government funding for a higher yeshiva and kollel students. It's about 150,000 men. The kollel subsidy stipend is valid until age 67. And so there's a requirement now to double government subsidies for those who decide to be in the kollel. There's a demand to pretty much double the government budget allocations to the Haredi education system, with a logic of 100% funding, 0% core curriculum requirements, and this will be enabled by removing the court from the picture. So the court was one of the barriers for some of these changes. So this important vector or feature of Israeli policy and trends and future outlook of what's going to happen with this huge community of 30% of our first graders, now this change of policy will mean that rather than going more towards integration in many senses, including integrating the ultra-Orthodox community into a first world economy, it's pretty much in the other way around. This is a major anticipated shift in policy.
So just 1 sec, we've just started to stream live on Facebook. So if you're joining us on Facebook, welcome. I'm Jodi from the Forward. I'm editor-in-chief of the Forward, Jodi Rudoren. I have with me Yohanan Plesner, the head of the Israel Democracy Institute, and Jacob Kornbluh, our senior political correspondent at the Forward. And I want to ask you, Jacob, what your kind of biggest takeaways are from the results and what you're watching in terms of who's going to get what in the coalition, what you're focused on figuring out?
So I think from from an American perspective, the way we look at the formation of the new government, obviously, it's a decisive victory for Netanyahu himself. I don't know if in America we would ever imagine that a president would serve 6 terms. And so, I mean, it is sort of like more of an historic moment, because I do believe that it's not only about the substance of the policy, as Yohanan very much laid out there. It will be sort of the Orthodox and religious right will have sort of that influence on government policy. But I also think that it's sort of, I mean, for the past 12 years, I mean, the 12 years that Netanyahu was in power for the second time, he always managed to sort of get a moderate party within the coalition that sort of served as sort of that the moderate voice, either in the cabinet itself. He had some Likud ministers who are very moderate, who are no more part of Likud, but also a party that he could say, well, you see, it's not a full right-wing government. I think for the first time, again, assuming that this will be sort of the makeup of the current government, it could change within 6 months or a year if Benny Gantz or some other party decide to join. But right now, it'll be interesting to see that for the first time, this will be a right-wing government, and the cabinet will sort of have not a majority, but also the entire cabinet would be sort of ministers with right-wing views. And that puts Netanyahu in a very unique position. And it's sort of, okay, we all try to think, be a little more optimistic and think that Netanyahu understands that in a government where you have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are more on the extreme side, and where you have Orthodox ministers, possibly an Orthodox minister who has said some, divisive comments during the election against other sectors of the Israeli society, that Netanyahu will serve as that moderate voice or balance in the cabinet. And you also have to understand that for Netanyahu, this might be his last term. I mean, you have his trial coming to an end in a few years. Obviously, we can't predict what will be the outcome of that trial. He could be vindicated and therefore run for another time for prime minister. But, based on, as they say, Mother Nature and his trial, it's assumed to be his last term. And therefore, if he wants to be in the books of history, he will sort of want to have that legacy of being that responsible voice, especially when Israel is facing so many challenges.
Yeah, I want to make a slightly blunter version of that, Jacob. I think you're right on. I mean, in the past, Netanyahu was basically the right flank of his own coalition, with maybe 1 or 2 people to his right. Now he's basically the left flank of this incoming coalition, right? I mean, it's kind of funny to think of him as the left flank of anything, and I guess to some extent, everybody's always asking, what's the real Netanyahu? What is his real North Star? And as you said, Jacob, like, what will he want his legacy to be? So I guess I'd ask you that a little bit, Yohanan, to respond to that. And then also we're going to need to get from there into explaining a little bit the rise of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and is this, and with the parallel decline of the left Zionist parties, as you said. So is this really who Israel is today? Is represented by?
I'll divide it into 2 interventions. Netanyahu deserves his one intervention. I agree with Jacob's analysis, except for this is the Netanyahu last term bit. His father published his biggest piece in his career at age 85. Netanyahu is now 73. He's in good health. He's full of ambition. He sees himself as a historical figure. He's not necessarily going anywhere. So I don't think that he's thinking about himself in terms of this is my final term. He does think in terms of a legacy. This is true. Now, you're absolutely right about the fact that he finds it very difficult not to have moderating factors in the coalition, that he can also blame them for their leftish policies and forcing him not to be the hardliner that he really wants. But now this is the political directive, or the politically he's closer in terms of views on the economy, on security, to Gantz and Lapid, rather than to Ben Gvir and the ultra-Orthodox on domestic issues, and Ben Gvir and Smotrich on security-wise. So there's a disparity between policy and politics. Policy-wise, Netanyahu and the historical Likud are a lot more moderate, and there's an all-time low in terms of differences between Israelis on the main issues. Politically wise,
what do you mean by that, Yohanan? And polls show that Israelis agree on the main issues?
On the issues, but we're as polarized as ever on questions of identity and in terms of tribal politics. So Netanyahu is building a cohesive coalition with his tribe and his allies, but policy-wise, he's much closer to centrist Israelis. But his degrees of freedom that characterized him in the past, where he would be able to lure in Ehud Barak, or lure in Lapid and Livni, or Moshe Kachlon, and so on, those degrees of political degrees of freedom are no longer an option as a result of those 4 years of crisis. The fact that he's under an indictment and dealing with a criminal case. Now, what will it mean for policy security-wise? Security-wise, Netanyahu has not been adventurous, as we know. Doesn't believe that it will serve him politically to be reckless in the way he instructs the military establishment and navigates Israel in this region. So we don't expect any deviation from past policy in this area.
So that means we don't expect him to move to annex the West Bank.
No.
We don't expect
sure
him
not
to
when
go
there's a
bulldoze
US
Gaza.
administration that he understands the importance of US-Israel relations. He's not going to do any of that. What worries me, I would say, is the fact that there are professional provocateurs in his government, like Ben Gvir, built a decades-long career of provocations that brought him to where he is. And, Ben Gvir going to Temple Mount as Minister of Homeland Security. Things can go out of hand, but it won't be a Netanyahu policy that will drive them out of hand. Same, Smotrich is different. Smotrich is to some extent more ideological than Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir is more of a provocateur. Smotrich is about making changes in the West Bank and so on. And here again, Netanyahu will have to deal with him. Similarly, in the economic front, I don't anticipate any major changes. Netanyahu, macroeconomically, again, except for a short period during COVID, proved to be a responsible leader. Israel's macroeconomic situation is rather healthy. There's no big ideological difference between center-left and the right wing in Israel, because the right wing economically is pretty much to the left and vice versa. So they meet in the middle. So economically, again, it's questions of competence. It is true that Aryeh Deri, that might become finance minister, made huge promises of we will give food vouchers and this and that, allocations to ultra-Orthodox and others. But by and large, we don't expect a major deviation from past policies. Where we do expect a deviation is, again, as I mentioned, a policy vis-a-vis ultra-Orthodox community, religion and state issues that might also cause drive a wedge between us and a big chunk of American Jewry. And the other area is, let's call them the domestic, constitutional, democratic arrangements that are very much under threat. And if Netanyahu, since he's so responsible, will understand that he does not have an interest in letting the security situation get out of hand, with respect to the domestic, constitutional, democratic situation, Netanyahu, given his current mindset, is not going to be the person that will block any deterioration. So this is the area to watch, and this is what it concerns me very much.
Jacob, as you look at the coalition negotiations and the appointments, what are you watching most in terms of ministerial posts, or in terms of, there are two parts of this, right? People trade away, make political gamesmanship out of the ministerial posts, as well as some policy positions. So what do you have your eye on? What do you expect to happen? And what do you think will be interesting? What will be revealing?
So I think compared to the two previous governments, which was, the last one was this change government made up of very different parties, which they almost didn't agree on anything, and it was a daily crisis, and to the rotation unity government with Benny Gantz, where every side had a veto on almost every, wherever you moved your hand, the other partner had a veto power. I think this is the first time, at least in the last 4 years, that the government has to prove that it's able to govern. And most of these ministers are going to be first-time ministers in the cabinet. It's not only the partners who will be new. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox, obviously, the Haredi parties will have a minister who is a rookie in terms of politics. He's 73 years old. But also within the Likud, there's expected to be about sort of 20 portfolios within the Likud, and most of them will be held by either Knesset members who have served not even a full term yet. And so that will be sort of their opportunity to actually show that the right can govern. So that's a good thing. If you agree with that, with a certain policy or not, everybody wants to sort of have not only political stability, but they also want to have a government that is there, that passes a budget, that enacts certain legislation that benefits all. That's on the political, on the governing level. I think on political and diplomatic, there's expected to be sort of a change in terms of when the current coalition was in the opposition. What they did was that they were very unified as a bloc in opposing the government on every level. No matter what the legislation, the bill was about, they were sort of, adamant on opposing and trying to bring out the government. The current opposition is not necessarily united. In fact, I think it's made out of three factions: the Yesh Atid, which is headed by Lapid and Labor, and then you have the Arab parties who will seek to sort of have some parliamentary negotiations with the government on certain funding, and then you have Benny Gantz, who would want to, if he could have only trusted Netanyahu, and if only Netanyahu would offer him, maybe he would have being part of the current coalition. So you can expect sort of the opposition to be divided very much, that will enable the government to pass legislation and not worry every day that it's going to be toppled. And lastly, the diplomatic level, it's very interesting, and we'll probably have a discussion about this, about how we compare the outcome of the Israeli election, the outcome of the American election. But overall, if Biden is still in office and he runs for a second term, it's different than in the years of Obama, where Netanyahu and Obama had one didn't like each other, and there was disagreements over key policies. Here we don't expect. I mean, the Iran deal is probably not on the table right now. Biden said it all the time, that not only is he a Zionist, but he actually loves Bibi on a personal level. We're
brothers, he said just the other day, right?
And so we won't see that friction. We won't see sort of a collision between policy. But again, everything is unexpected, because we don't know what influences Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich will actually have.
So let's get into that a little bit more. I mean, so Ben-Gvir wants to be the Minister of Homeland Security. Smotrich wants to be the Defense Minister. Unclear if he'll get to be, right? Who will be Foreign Minister in this government?
Somebody from Likud, but
someone from Likud. Okay.
Foreign Minister is sort of has been downgraded as a center of power.
Because Netanyahu, of course, will be the real foreign minister, right? So, okay, let's talk about Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Yohanan, you helpfully describe Ben Gvir as a provocateur and Smotrich as an ideological purist about, greater Israel. He believes not only should the Jews control all the land between the river and the sea, but that Israel should be governed by the laws of the Torah, I believe. So that's when you say ideological, that's what you mean. Can you explain for us on one foot briefly the rise of these two men who seem really, I think Americans were really, really surprised to hear that this is who Israelis want to lead them. And particularly that so many young people flock to Ben Gvir. What is the attraction? Are one of them likely to be prime minister someday soon? What should we make of their rise?
Cut the suspense. They're not en route to become prime minister, and once you hear the explanation, you'll understand that it's it doesn't represent a fundamental change in the Israeli electorate. So there's always a political real estate right of Likud, a party that is more hardline, tough talk. You've been, Jodi, in Israel, you remember Lieberman confiscated this real estate at one point. Bennett then replaced him there. So there's always this straight talk of, we should cut the nonsense and quit apologizing and obviously, when you think a country that is experiencing terror and now also a rise in crime that mainly, unfortunately, emanates from organized crime coming from the Arab sector, because organized crime in the Jewish sector was pretty much, I wouldn't say evaporated, but handled properly by the police. But crime in the Arab sector is still a big problem, both for the Arab sector, but it's there's a spillover. So once, in the eyes of many in the Israeli public, mainly in the periphery, rise in car thefts, in acts of violence, and combined with the rise in terror, both in the West Bank and the wave of terror of March and April, created this sense of lack of security. Now, sense of lack of security is the key factor that makes political that has political implications. Obviously, we remember in the mid-90s the terror attacks that led to the crumbling of Oslo and the rise of Netanyahu in the first time. Now, this sense of violence in the streets, combined with the fact that for the first time we had an Islamic party in the government, was proof to many that the propaganda that said Islamic party in the government means that the government could not deal properly with crime and terror from the Arab sector. And the fact that then there was a rise in terror proved that this propaganda is right, and therefore we need to end this situation of a government that is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm again repeating the propaganda, and in order to restore stability and safety and so on. So this, now Ben Gvir, starting from, he has an entire career, but starting on May of last year, when there were these events and lynching in Ramle and Akko, in central Israel and in the Negev, and Arab mobsters, a very unpleasant situation with Palestinian flags. Ben Gvir went there to every place and used the digital networks in a very effective manner. And since he wasn't in power in any way, employed a very decisive rhetoric and so on. That led to this, these, establishment that are stuttering and so on, versus the Ben Gvir that is authentic and so on. So, the authentic language, it's throughout the world now. So this represents right of Likud. There's always room for a decisive, clear right-wing party. A rise of terror, Islamic party in government, Ben Gvir representing an anti-establishment vote that feels more in the Israeli periphery, that is tends to believe more conspiracy theories and all of that. It's not necessarily an ideologically extreme electorate, but it's an electorate that is more suspicious of the establishment, and the fact that this ended up being grudgingly, for many of the national religious sector, grudgingly, it was the party of their tribe. So they didn't have an option. Bennett vanished.
Right. I mean, I was struck today to read something.
Rights, so they stayed there.
I was reading the other day in the New York Times, I think there's a description of what you're talking about, that there's always this national religious party, the history of the national religious party, or the party that represents religious Zionists, and it referred to Jewish Home, Bennett and Shaked's party, as moderate, which was hilarious to me, since of course they were the far right when I was there.
Yeah, because they occupied this territory.
They occupied that territory,
and then
right?
Bennett,
but
once
to
in
think of
power,
them now
moderated.
in relationship.
Once in power, moderated. But and he left this piece of real estate vacant, and Smotrich jumped in.
Jacob, I want to ask you, let's talk about the parallels between, we had these two elections a week apart. And obviously Israel and America and the United States of America are completely different places in every way, small, big, young, older, whatever, coalition government, two-party system. There's really, but we have we talk about our shared values. There are some shared trends, there are some global trends. People made parallels between Netanyahu and Trump. Now people making parallels between Ben Gvir and Trump. I mean, if you take the sort of consensus narrative of the pundit class, right? The basics on the Israeli election are that it was a shoring up of the far right, an emergence of extremist ideology and characters, these in Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and the prevailing narrative on the US elections is that it was a rejection of Trumpism, Trump-backed extreme candidates like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. So I wondered, Jacob, if you could start us off on kind of how would you compare and contrast these two? Are they, where do you see any similarities? Do you think they are divergent? How do you look at them together, since you have to?
I think it's two different elections. I mean, a part of the fact that in America you have an executive branch and the Congress, which is sort of, you can have a president from one party and the Congress controlled by another party. I think it was also a different election. Okay, in Israel they went to the polls to finally see some stability and a governing coalition, and obviously the missteps that the left the parties on the left took, and the division amongst the Arab parties led to the fact that Netanyahu has now a majority, and not only a rather thin majority, not only 61 or 60. I mean, you know, so it's very different on that level. But I think also it was a different election here in America, because usually midterms are a referendum on the presidency, right? But here was sort of a preview of the 2024 election, and in some ways a continuation of the 2020 elections. Because if you see, all the election deniers got defeated. It's not necessarily that people who believe in most of the views that Trump believes in or support Trump, they actually won in certain key states. J.D. Vance is probably, you know, more to the Trump side than Mitch McConnell. And look at the results in New York, where candidates defeated longtime Democratic incumbents. So it was sort of a continuation of that division between Trump republicanism and those who want to see sort of a party, you know, a actual difference in substance and in policy. And again, if in 2024, if the election is between Trump and Biden, I mean, I don't see any way, actually based on the results of this midterm elections, that Biden might actually defeat Trump once again. And so that was sort of the preview of the 2024, you know, also sort of a continuation of the 2020, because it was never sort of considered by Trump. But I also believe that the issues here are very different, okay? The issues here were about both abortion and Supreme Court that motivated the Democrats to actually come out to vote. The Republicans' only motivation to come out to vote was to be a sort of a check and balance on the Biden presidency, or to investigate, or to pay back for the January 6th committee. So the motivation to actually see a outcome where the country goes on a path forward was on the Democrat side. And what we see is, even if the Republicans take control of the House, it will be a super thin majority that wouldn't enable them to do nothing. It will obviously be stopped by the Senate and the presidency. So it's sort of very different when you compare it to Israel,
Okay.
where the voters actually went out to see a change in government.
So let's build from there to talk about the impact of the Israeli elections on American Jews and on the
Just
relationship.
one quick
Yeah,
point
go
on
ahead.
the difference. Israelis, and perhaps it's the opposite. Those who voted for Netanyahu, another incentive, or the Netanyahu camp, was that Netanyahu offered a credible path for the end of the political crisis. You are one of his, strong campaign. It was basically a campaign with two legs. One was, we want to end this thing of the Islamists in government. And obviously this resonates with many Israelis who find it difficult to digest, given the situation of a conflict and so on, the fact that, an Islamist party has its hands on the wheel. And the number two was, your vote would be the 61 vote, i.e., and then we have stability for 4 years, where Lapid's best value proposition was, vote for me, I will continue to block Netanyahu, and we can roll together to election number 6. So if Trump, to some extent, some of the ideas of, tampering with the election process offered some path to instability, this actually, Netanyahu offered a path to stability. Now, many of those.
So maybe voters in both places voted for stability, an end to the electoral crisis.
Exactly. Now, many of those, although Netanyahu's coalition, as I mentioned before, might initiate a constitutional overhaul, many of those who voted for Netanyahu didn't pay attention to those details, because for them, Netanyahu is a known quantity. He's been around for a generation. And when those constitutional issues are raised, they're like, look, Netanyahu has been around. He was rather pragmatic, rather conservative. Why do you think he's going to initiate those changes? So
okay, we're going to get to that in just a second, but I want, and it's 11:43. I want to, we have a bunch of good questions from the audience. I'm going to combine a few of them. I think there's a number of questions about the impact on, there's sort of 3 parts of this, right? On the relationship with American Jews, things that are already starting to happen, discussions of changing the conversion policy and pluralism. Relationship with America in general, with Washington. Jacob talked a little bit about the fact that Biden and Netanyahu have a good relationship. And then, as Simon Fink put it, does Israel face a legitimacy crisis domestically and internationally? So the impact internationally of a farther right government. So very briefly, can you give us some thoughts on those impacts, each of you? You can start, Yohanan, go ahead.
I'll start. So the biggest impact will be probably on questions of pluralism, religion, and state. So this is where I expect a real and credible tension to that would actually be based on tangible government policy, government legislation. On the 2 other fronts, U.S.-Israel relations, so there's joint interest. Nothing will happen in the Palestinian arena in either direction, because we've been around it, Jodi, in these discussions for years. There's no Palestinian side that is anyway ready to move forward with anything significant. So the status quo, Netanyahu is not seeking adventure, so the status quo will continue. There's no vector even on the Iranian front. The movement towards a deal has been suspended. So what is there to fight about with the Americans?
We do have, but internationally, I mean, we have both for American Jews and in the international arena, we have this growing critique, growing numbers of agencies and people calling Israel an apartheid state, including growing numbers of young American Jews. The Pew study shows divide, the younger American Jews not feeling connected to Israel, is this not going to worsen that situation?
Well, I mean, nothing in terms of an immediate or perhaps not. The government policy will not change in any significant manner to expedite these processes. I mean, obviously, those are long-standing debates and issues, and we can, on each of those, conduct a webinar and analyze what's true and what's false and so on. But nothing, again, except for perhaps, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir initiating various provocations, but in terms of a government direction, Netanyahu will set it. The ultra-Orthodox have no interest in changing trajectory on those areas. So we don't expect any major change. Now, again, if indeed this government will not sort of make do with some changes that will change the balance and somewhat weaken the ability of the court to conduct judicial review, but actually if some of the maximalist plans of this coalition will be turned into legislation and policy, and within a few months, again, I don't know what the probability is, but within a few months, there is some probability that Israel's constitutional situation will be similar to that of Hungary or Poland, where majority of power is concentrated within the hands of the political majority. If this will be the case, I mean, it's mainly something that should worry Israelis like me, that cherish and care about their democracy and rights and checks and balances. But I'm sure that it will also not help Israel's posture within the Western democratic
Right.
world.
So this is teeing up a number of questions that we have from the audience. First of all, we've dispatched with some. Jan, Jeb, and Eilon asked, what about Netanyahu attacking Iran? You don't think that's going to happen? Raymond,
Just one thing on Iran. I think Iran, because Jacob said before, Netanyahu finds it awkward from a political perspective to be the moderating factor within his own coalition. He doesn't like it. It's projecting weakness. The way to circumvent this problem will be to elevate the Iranian issue. And in this respect, to shush, silence Ben-Gvir and so on. Listen, there's a bigger issue now. This is why I don't want you to go on Temple Mount, not because I'm a weak lefty or something. So I see a political interest in elevating the Iranian issue even beyond.
He may also use it to sort of court Gantz into a coalition if he sees that it's becoming very difficult to govern with Ben-Gvir, to say Israel faces a challenge, we need to act on Iran, and this is a responsible time for other parties to join.
Difficult time. What about the Palestinians? Raymond Termini asks, what do you think the Israeli election results will mean for the Palestinians? Yohanan, you said nothing will happen on the Palestinian front in a big way. Jacob, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, the Palestinians are not ready, actually, to think about. I think that the administration, you have to understand, Israelis. We always joke that Israelis, until this cycle, these last few cycles, that the span of an Israeli government is 2 years. In America, actually, we have 2 terms because it's the midterms and then you have the presidential. And I think that the Democrats heading into a presidential year will not, Biden especially won't be too hard on Israel when it comes to the Palestinian issue. But also, the fact that both of the candidates, both the president and his team and everybody will be on the campaign trail. So they won't necessarily have that time and energy to pressure the Israeli government on the Palestinian side. But I also believe that Netanyahu sincerely believes that if he only gets a pact with Saudi Arabia, that this will change the whole, the makeup of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And he's very focused on that, right? That he wants that to be one of his first big achievements.
Right. Yeah, now, for this, he also needs to rein in Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, because if they start with provocations, it will for sure weaken the relationship or the ability to solidify the relationship with Bahrain, the Emirates, and of course with the Saudis. Now, the fact that the Americans and the Saudis are not in a honeymoon is not great for Israeli interests in terms of solidifying the moderate axis in the region. So this will make it even more difficult for Netanyahu to strengthen the relationship with Saudi Arabia, because part of the appeal is obviously to get through Israel to reach America.
So you were talking about on the big picture level, not expecting big diplomatic changes with the relationship with the Palestinians. From a day-to-day perspective about what life is going to be like for Palestinians living in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, worse or status quo?
No, nothing will change. I mean, it's a difficult, nothing will change. I mean, we look at the Palestinian leadership, it's completely stagnated now. Abu Mazen in his late 80s is not going anywhere and is not ready to make, not interested and not ready to make any decisions, no popularity, high levels of corruption.
Certainly we expect this government to continue settlement expansion, to not rein in settler violence.
We've not been building new settlements for, as you know, for many years. They won't build any new settlements. There were understandings between Israel and multiple U.S. administrations on what's called natural growth within the existing building line and so on. This will probably continue.
Okay, we have a couple questions here. I think we can dispatch with that. Alan Sattel and Robert Friedman both want to know whether Netanyahu will change policy towards Ukraine, military aid or otherwise. Yohanan,
No. I mean, the main line generally in questions of security and foreign policy are sort of set, except for the Palestinian issue, are set by the defense establishment, and nothing is expected to change vis-a-vis Ukraine. Israel supported Ukraine diplomatically. Is obviously part of the U.S. camp. They're supported in the UN. All relevant.
Has Netanyahu spoken with Zelensky?
The red line was not to transfer assault weapons. Since, again, the Russians are our neighbors in Syria, the situation in Syria continues. It might not be published in America, but every week Israel is operating there in order to prevent Iran and its proxies from establishing themselves. And if we want the Russians to continue to enable the status quo, we reach the red line, and Netanyahu is not expected to change it.
Okay, so let's get back. You showed us the slide about the potential changes to the judiciary, and there are a number of questions that people have related to that. First of all, Albert Friedas asks what will be the impact of the opinion piece signed by 126 members of law faculties from a number of universities warning of potential changes to the judiciary. So that's one aspect of this question. And then we have a number of people asking about Netanyahu's corruption trial. Why is it taking so long? Please explain the process. What will happen with the criminal proceedings now that he's back in the Prime Minister's office? What is happening? Does it affect his position in the new government? So those are related, not the same question. But first of all, big picture, how likely are these judicial changes to take effect? And then I guess separately, what will happen to Netanyahu's trial? Yeah,
so it's two issues that are obviously linked. And this is probably, if there's one takeaway from this entire discussion, this is the area where we're expecting an immediate, perhaps we're expecting, or there's a reasonable probability that there will be significant changes in the judicial, in terms of eroding, undermining the independence of the judiciary, changing the nature of checks and balances in Israeli democracy. I mean, if there's one area that we should look out for that is, from my vantage point, very worrying in terms of this expected policy of the new government, it is this area. It's related to Netanyahu's trial, but generally it can be treated as two, while we understand that they're linked, two separate issues. Netanyahu's trial is a simpler issue. It's going to continue because it's expected to take, anywhere between 3.5 to 5 years, including an appeal and so on. He's pretty comfortable dragging the process. The political effects are already factored in, and to some extent are even serving Netanyahu in his own base. So in the near future, nothing big is going to happen on the trial front. On the constitutional front, we will know within 3 weeks what are the coalition agreements. Within up to 3 weeks, what do they contain? And up to 3 months, when this government will pass a budget, it will have to be linked with legislating those changes to the judiciary and so on, because this is the only place where the coalition partners know that they have veto on each other. If you don't vote for this, we won't vote. So this is the deadline. And what we expect there is, what we're hearing are some fundamental changes that if I, want to distill it, it's to significantly weaken the only institutional check that we otherwise have on the otherwise absolute power of a political majority, and this is the independent judiciary. I think, you might know this slide. This is a comparing the Israeli situation to the US. So we don't have a constitution. We don't have local states, that have some power. We don't have an independent Congress. Knesset, as you know, is completely controlled by the government. So what we have is this one institution, the court, and now there's a cluster of initiatives that, if implemented in aggregate, will mean that the court will remain mainly, a court of appeals for, criminal matters and so on, but will not serve its constitutional role as checking the otherwise absolute power of a political majority and protecting basic rights, protecting ensuring the principle of separation of powers and so on. So this is, it might be, I hope to be wrong, but from what I'm hearing from the negotiations, some fundamental changes to the institutional nature of Israeli democracy are now being debated. And there is an absolute majority in the Knesset to do it.
And I mean, getting back to our previous questions in terms of how that would affect Israel's legitimacy internationally and among American Jews, American politicians, it seems like that would, the idea of the erosion of this key democratic institution protecting the idea of, many people do not think Israel right now is functioning as a democratic state. This would not help that image, right, Jacob?
No, I'm sure it won't help, but it's not like, Israel will continue to have, hopefully free and fair elections and a parliament and so on. So the nature of the checks and balances and the degree to which there's independence of the judiciary, those changes are sort of each individually, they sound sometimes technical, sometimes boring, but in aggregate, there's a huge implication. Now, what will it do for Israel's public policy? I'm not quite sure, because people don't really care about other countries' domestic internal arrangements. They care about Israeli policy vis-a-vis the region and so on. So I'm not sure, but again, I don't know.
I would say, I would just add that I think that is the most concerning part here. Yohanan, you live in Israel, so it's difficult for you to understand that on a daily basis, Americans, in conversation, engagement, the focus, the criticism of Israel, other than being anti-Semitic, a legitimate criticism of Israel is about human rights, is about the policies actually of the Israeli government. It's not always about the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue is factored into that concern about human rights. And I believe that even though Netanyahu might have a great relationship with Biden, with Blinken, with Jake Sullivan, and everything would be smooth over there regarding certain policies, the fact that young Americans, not necessarily even American Jews, right, are very much concerned about the direction Israel has taken in recent years. And I expect there to be a real crisis there unless the Israeli government acts on that matter.
Yeah, it will erode the shared values component of the relationship.
100%. It gives legs to that argument for sure. So I want to just surface, Stephen Feingold made a really good point in the Q&A. He said our speakers are ignoring the responsive of the Palestinian people themselves, noted that the violence last year was not created by leaders, but by individuals, by people, and that continuing the status quo is sitting on a powder keg. He said he's reminded of listening to Israeli talking heads in August 1973, telling his group of young Judeans that the Arabs don't have the ability to fight us, so we don't need to do anything. And he says the biggest failures of Israel have been by us underestimating outside forces. I certainly hear you, Stephen, and think you're right in saying that the status quo, the idea that the status quo can just be sustained forever and that there will not be a turn either by Palestinians themselves uprising, or in terms of the international legitimacy and international pressure on Israel that could really threaten its continuation as a Jewish and democratic state, I think is correct. That and this idea that if the headline of the Israeli election is somehow let's continue the status quo, stability, go back to the prime minister we have known, I think there's a naivete to think that that status quo can just keep continuing and nothing will change around it. We are basically out of time, but I want each of you to have a chance to just make any final comments or points. We had great questions from the audience. Thank you. As I said earlier, you will all receive the video as well as some of those slides that the IDI folks shared with us. I want to thank again Yohanan and Ellie Bennett from IDI for joining us for this event, and Matt Littman and Aaron White of our staff. And again, thank you all for being here and for supporting The Forward. We are a reader-supported nonprofit newsroom. Jacob, some final thoughts, and then Yohanan, you can close us out.
Yeah, I think what we should look for to see is both the political level and diplomatic level is how Netanyahu navigates all these demands from his coalition partners in actually implementing policy. If it's all about portfolios, if it's all about positions, he's an experienced politician. He has 3 decades of knowing how to satisfy his coalition partners, but also on the diplomatic level. I mean, there are rumors, obviously, that Ron Dermer was offered to serve as foreign minister. That would be, I mean, very toxic in terms of a relationship with the US, but it also could serve sort of that sort of person from outside that he might bring either into the defense or to the foreign ministry, figure that can sort of be sort of that moderate voice or responsible voice to sort of tamper down the demands of his coalition partners when it comes to policy that we all care about.
So, Jodi, thanks again for this lively discussion on Palestinian politics and judiciary. Palestinian, even if I agree with everything you said, status quo and everything, again, putting on the table, I'm a centrist. The fact that, the question is what can be done if there isn't another side and so on. So again, here even if I agree with the diagnosis, it doesn't mean that there's a prognosis that can be adopted. And in this respect, I don't think any fundamental change is going to be implemented. Judiciary-wise, I agree with Stephen Sinclair wrote on one of the chats, Israel is a beacon for human rights, but if we will erode, undermine, minimize, shut down the one institution that ensures that we are a beacon, then it will not continue to be a beacon. So we do have an institution, the Supreme Court, that ensures, and we're proud of it, and we're proud of our democracy that has been so strong under such pressure, but we do not want it to succumb under this pressure. So this is what really worries me. Politically, I hear in Jacob's music this sort of idea that perhaps the coalition would be broadened with more moderate forces. It's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. Netanyahu will not break up the alliance that brought him back into power. He needs Ben Gvir and Smotrich politically. But Gantz cannot enter to a coalition on top of an existing majority where he's completely powerless. It would only make political sense to enter if the others go out, and therefore it's a real partnership where Gantz accepts Netanyahu as prime minister, but comes in with real power. Netanyahu will never give him this power politically, and therefore it will remain an aspiration of many center-right and center-left moderate Israelis that want to see a government, a more mainstream government that reflects their views. But politically, it doesn't make sense, at least not in the foreseeable future. Thank you, Jodi and Jacob.
Thank you, Yohanan, and thank you all for being with us.